this word evolution has 6 meanings.
No, there are only 2. There is the colloquial meaning of the word evolution, which is any old change over time, and there is the scientific theory of evolution. Unless otherwise specified, when scientists use the word evolution, they are specifically referring to an aspect of population genetics.
We've been through this before, so I'm going to go through it kind of quickly. There's first of all cosmic evolution, Big Bang.
The preacher has been corrected about this numerous times, but he keeps repeating the same error, conflating cosmology with evolution. Darwinian evolution is a theory of biodiversity. That means biology, paleontology, taxonomy. The Big Bang is a theory of cosmogony. That means astronomy and physics. The 2 theories are not in any sense related. The Big Bang was first proposed by a religious physicist, Monseigneur Georges Lemaitre, back in 1927. When Darwin proposed his theory of evolution in 1859, most everyone thought that even if God had created the world that we live in, the universe around it was eternal. And contrary to the prevalent view of the steady-state universe, Lemaitre explained how the universe is in fact expanding, implying an initial point where everything was compressed into what he described as a super-atom. Eventually, his arguments and evidence swayed the scientific community to admit that he was probably right. And some evangelical preachers like Frank Turek, for example, reject evolution, but they accept Big Bang. So the Big Bang is obviously not part of evolutionary theory.
Secondly, chemical evolution, where all the chemicals come from hydrogen. That's baloney.
No, as long as you can add neutrons when necessary, then you really can make a helium atom out of 2 hydrogens. Add a 3rd hydrogen, you get lithium. A 4th will get you beryllium, and so on. That's an established fact. That's how chemistry works. This chart spells it out. You'd think someone who claims to have taught high school science for 15 years would have read this table at least periodically. Also, it's not chemical evolution. It's stellar nucleosynthetic theory, proposed by an astronomer, Fred Hoyle, in 1946. Hoyle is commonly described as an atheist, but he was actually a strange sort of creationist who believed in myriad creation events going on all the time, and he objected to evolution using infantile arguments for intelligent design. So if Hoyle heard that his theory of stellar nucleosynthesis was considered part of evolution theory, he would lose his mind if, he hadn't lost it already.
Thirdly, stellar evolution, where all the stars form from dust. You cannot get dust to condense into a solid star. Can't happen. There's Boyle's gas laws that drive it away, okay?
Well, stars are not solid, and we're talking about gases more than dust. And I think the preacher meant to refer to ideal gas laws, which can be violated by gases interacting, because we're not always talking about ideal gases either. Ideal gas laws combine Boyle's law and Charles' law and states that for a specified quantity of gas, the product of the volume, V, and pressure, P, is proportional to the absolute temperature, T. In this equation, N is the density of the gas and R is the ideal gas constant. But what throws all that off is when we increase the volume so much that we have to account for the additional influence of gravity too. So the volume goes up, the pressure goes up, the temperature goes up until the whole thing collapses under its own weight into a protostar, such that we're not even talking about gases anymore, but plasma, the 4th state of matter. At its coldest, everything is frozen solid. Heat it up and it melts into a liquid. Heat that up and it evaporates into gas. Then if you heat up the gas high enough, it becomes plasma, which could be understood as the energy form of matter. Remember that matter and energy are the same thing, and that mere matter can be described as a slowed down form of energy. But again, we're not talking about stellar evolution. This is nebular theory, proposed by Emanuel Swedenborg in 1734 and Immanuel Kant in 1755, and separately by mathematics engineer Pierre-Simon Laplace in 1796. Kant and Laplace also proposed the core accretion theory, being a scientific explanation of planetary formation. And again, the formation of stars and planets has nothing to do with the theory of evolution. None of those guys in the 1700s had even heard of evolution. I wonder why all the Nobel Prize-winning physicists think that the stars really can form in accordance with these laws. And why should we ignore all the experts to instead believe the guy who never got any relevant education and who is always wrong about everything he says about this? I should add that when I started my activism back on Talk.Origins back in the days of Usenet, they had an archive listing and rebutting creationist claims. When this preacher started saying that stars couldn't form because of Boyle's gas laws, the team decided that that statement was too absurd to include in a list of creationist claims, because it was so ridiculous that this preacher is the only one who would even say such a thing.
Then there's enough stars out there, though we can all have 11 trillion to ourselves.
That fact is a strong argument against the idea that the universe was created with humanity in mind. If we can only inhabit a fraction of the surface of this one tiny ball of rock and metal, and the distances between the worlds are so vast that to get anywhere else is cost prohibitive, requiring the height of technology just for a one-way trip, and we can't survive anywhere else. And we've never yet heard from any other people out there, Romulans, Klingons, Vulcans, whatever. And except for our own planet, every world we've ever seen so far has been dead. Then the universe was pretty obviously not created for us. The assumption that it was is so naive. It's like when you buy a betta fish in those little cups in the pet store, and you put that cup on a rock in the desert somewhere, and then the fish pretends that the desert was made just for him. Obviously not. No intelligent designer would have created a universe with so much wasted space where we'll die instantly everywhere except for this one tiny little spot where we're trapped.
Then you have organic evolution, where life gets started from non-living material.
Again, it's not organic evolution, it's abiogenesis, which is a collection of well-supported hypotheses, nearly all of which could be true at the same time. We'll talk a lot more about that in a later episode.
And then macroevolution, where an animal changes to a different kind of animal.
No, and just like evolution never taught that we came from a rock, evolution never taught and does not allow one kind of animal to change into a different kind of animal. That is a straw man, a farcical distortion that creationists made up that does not apply, and that would actually violate the natural laws of evolution. Creationists are seemingly incapable and or unwilling to describe evolution accurately. As we explained in the previous episode, macroevolution begins with speciation, the origin of species, just as Darwin said himself.
None of those have ever been observed.
Some of them have been or are being observed, and there's substantial evidence for all of them, especially the last one, which is actually even better supported than the theory of gravity.
Number 6, variations within the kinds, sometimes called microevolution. That one happens.
Except that there is no such thing as a kind unless you mean species, and if you accept speciation, then that's macroevolution, not micro.
The first 5 are religious.
This preacher thinks that any belief, even a testable, evidence-based hypothesis, is somehow a religion. That if you can't prove it, that makes it religious. We'll talk more about that in the next episode. And one thing that he and many other creationists ignore is that we can effectively prove evolution with an overwhelming preponderance of evidence beyond reasonable doubt, though that requires a lot of education and correction of the false knowledge that creationists think they know, but they don't. Religious faith has self-defense mechanisms, such that zealots are afraid of that challenge, demanding absolute proof instead, even though absolute proof is only applicable to mathematics. Then there's the fallacy of the double standard, since their own position is just a circular argument, simply assuming their conclusion without any evidence at all, but demanding absolute proof of the contrary. And science is an investigation. That means evaluating hypotheses. Religious extremists seem to be unable to think hypothetically, but often scientists consider and test multiple hypotheses at once, and whichever one is best supported prevails, even if they were rooting for another one. Science doesn't care what you believe. All that matters is the reason why you believe it. The more evidence you have, the better your reason to believe. But if all you have is faith in your scriptures, mere stories told by people, then you believe without any rational reason, but because of emotion or conditioning. Religion is exactly opposite of scientific skepticism, because then the only thing that matters is whether you believe, and they don't care why you do or don't.
So whenever you discuss evolution, you have to define what you're talking about. If you're talking about number 6, I'm with you. I agree, that happens. If you're talking about the first 5, that doesn't happen. That's something you believe happens, okay?
The first 5 evidently do happen, and I've shown this preacher documented evidence for each of these things, though he has never admitted any mistake, no matter how obvious. And he even omitted or deleted videos where he would have to admit correction to keep on saying what was shown to be wrong.
Watch how they change the definition for the kids. They say, okay, boys and girls, evolution is change over time. Is that really what they mean? Watch this carefully now. In other words, living things have changed over time. Wait. Are you going to skip over the first 4? They just want to bypass the first 4 stages like it's not part of the theory? Well, then you don't have a coherent theory.
I think creationist apologists must be somehow forbidden from understanding or admitting what a scientific theory really is. No one ever taught these 6 different kinds of evolution that this preacher claims. He seems to be limited to binary thinking. The very first foundational falsehood of creationism is the false dichotomy that you're either a biblical literalist religious extremist, or else the only other option is that you're necessarily a materialist atheist. Even if you're one of the many competent Christians who understand and accept science, this know-nothing preacher will lump you in with the atheists, because he erroneously conflates evolution with philosophical naturalism. Thus, in his mind, all scientific theories concerning natural origins of anything are necessarily part of the one overarching theory of atheistic materialism. The 6th foundational falsehood of creationism is the idea believers have that because their religion is a complex system of many associated beliefs, that scientific explanations also have to be one body, one overarching theory that accounts for the origin of life, the universe, and everything. Because it always comes down to whether there's a God or not. Somehow that's every argument. But it's not that way. And Darwin didn't know or care how or if the universe began. And that doesn't really matter to me either. And no matter what that explanation may turn out to be, it won't change the fact that humans are evolving apes. And remember that when Swedenborg, Kant, and Laplace came up with their theories of stellar and planetary formation, there was as yet no theory of evolution. They didn't need one because that's a different topic. When Darwin published that theory, he was still a Christian at that time, content to believe, as many science-minded Christians still do, that God created the universe wound up and running on its own. Many Christians, most of them in fact, believe all of that and accept evolution too. Nucleosynthesis can't be part of evolution either, because the guy who devised that theory hated evolution, having no understanding of it and believing in intelligent design. And Big Bang is not a materialist theory, because that was devised by a Catholic priest who liked the idea of the universe having a beginning, which he could then attribute to God. So this science-denying, know-nothing preacher got everything wrong out of willful ignorance and bigotry, trying to sell a false dichotomy.
Then they say, evolution is defined as a change in species over time. Now they're down to what I believe in. I think species can change. I think you can get some really weird varieties of animals, but they're still the same kind, okay?
I'll put a link below to the Phylogeny challenge, which is one way to prove that there is no such thing as a kind other than species. If you think there is some higher taxonomic rank that includes multiple species that evolved from a common ancestor but that can no longer interbreed and bring forth offspring after their own kind, then you accept evolution, micro and macro. You may as well just admit that. You're an evolutionist. But if you want to pretend that this higher category represents separate kinds that were magically created unrelated to anything else, then you should take the Phylogeny challenge. If you want the short version of that, then show me 4 species, 2 from the same kind and 2 from 2 other kinds that scientists would say are very closely related to the first 2, so that we have an example of 3 different kinds that would have been on Noah's mythic ark. No one can meet that challenge, and believers won't even try to, because they already know there's no such thing as a kind, which is why they refuse to define what a kind is, nor will they say how we can tell one kind apart from another. When you work with a collection of words that are all deliberately left undefined, then what you're describing is literally nonsense.
This is a lie, kids. That's not really what they mean by evolution.
Yes, that is the one and only thing they really do mean by evolution. Note that this preacher is directly citing the very sources that prove him wrong, telling us that the textbooks say what they clearly do not say, and ignoring the fact that they really do say and mean what he says they don't. There are not 6 kinds of evolutionary theory. There is only one, and it includes both micro and macro.
They want to give you examples of number 6 and make you believe that the whole theory has been proven. Don't get brainwashed.
Don't get brainwashed, he says, while he is misleading a church congregation about what evolution actually is and what a theory is, since science doesn't allow theories to be proven in the absolute sense that creationists are talking about. This preacher is amazing in one respect, in that every sentence he's said so far is wrong. I study evolution. I can prove that it's real and that I know what I'm talking about. But I don't pretend to know how the universe began, if it did. I don't pretend to know how chemicals came about or any of that, nor does it matter to what I study. I'll accept what I understand to be currently the leading explanations, but that doesn't mean I necessarily believe them, nor that I don't think someone will improve them or maybe even come up with something better. My primary interest is evolution, not any of that other stuff the preacher brought up that has nothing to do with evolution.
Most evolutionists will say, well, macroevolution is just micro with longer periods of time. No, it's not.
Yes, it is, although it doesn't always have to be long periods of time. There are some speciation events that happen surprisingly quickly, too.
They had a big conference on this very question in Chicago. They said the central question of the Chicago conference was whether the mechanisms underlying microevolution can be extrapolated to explain the phenomena of macroevolution. The answer can be given as a clear no. It doesn't work.
The author of that quote didn't say that it doesn't work. In fact, in the very next sentence, the author says, what is not so clear, however, is whether microevolution is totally decoupled from macroevolution. The two can more probably be seen as a continuum with a notable overlap. Note that it says exactly the opposite of what the preacher just told you it said. Once again, when we check the actual sources of these mind quotations, we see a very different message. In the preceding sentences, just before this quote, in the same paragraph, the author clearly says that the changes within a population have been termed microevolution, and they can indeed be accepted as consequences of shifting gene frequencies. Changes above the species level, involving the origin of new species and the establishment of higher taxonomic patterns, are known as macroevolution. Thus proving again that this preacher doesn't know what micro or macroevolution even are. Then in the middle of the quoted sentence, there is another part that the preacher omitted, wherein the author had already described heated debates among scientists at that time, and he said that his opinion was at risk of doing violence to some of the positions held at that conference. I would say that my position is at risk of doing violence to his answer, especially given all we've learned in the 40 years since then. If you took a class on evolution way back in 1980, there wouldn't be that much to teach because they didn't know that much about it yet. I remember when they were still having this debate. Seriously, the last half century or so has been a boon in both paleontology and genetics, and nearly everything we've learned about speciation has happened since then. We got this. And because micro and macroevolution are clearly defined correctly in the quoted paragraph, that not only shows that the preacher is wrong about how he's trying to mislabel and misuse those words, but it also negates his own citation, because he already admitted that he accepts macroevolution as it is defined here. So he is actually unwittingly saying that what he believes in doesn't work. It doesn't matter that he doesn't understand any of the nuance that this author was referring to way back then. The preacher has not only misrepresented that and contradicted himself, he has even refuted his own argument.
Variations happen, sure, but they have limits. Did you know farmers have been trying to get bigger pigs for a long time? Do you think they'll ever get a pig as big as Texas? Nah, I bet there's a limit, isn't there? Okay?
That's not a limit to evolution, that's a limit to physics. The preacher thinks that his God made pigs, and he's now admitting that not even God could make a pig as big as Texas. Because even if we could breed a pig that big, he would stay on script and say that it's not evolution because it's still a pig.
Roaches become resistant to pesticides. Do you think they'll ever become resistant to a sledgehammer? Probably not.
Again, that is an issue of physics, not evolution. Thus, the preacher's criticism is irrelevant. That said, evolution has produced some pretty stout arthropods that might even be able to withstand a blow from a sledgehammer.
See, there's a tiger had 3 kittens, all different colors, same litter. That's variations, but it's still a tiger.
And according to the evolutionary law of monophily, they will always be tigers, even if their distant descendants change so much that they don't even look like tigers anymore. Remember that evolution is descent with inherent modification. So the law of monophily holds that every new genus or species or anything that ever evolved was just a modified version of whatever its ancestors were. Thus, you can never grow out of your ancestry. You still belong to every parent clade your ancestors did, and so will all of your descendants, even if they begin a new clade that doesn't include you.
That's not evolution.
Evolution is defined as variation in allele frequencies in reproductive populations over many generations. So if those cubs were born with a mutation for a different color, and they pass that on to their descendants, and that mutation continues to spread throughout the population such that there is eventually a whole new group of these odd-colored tigers, then we could and would call that evolution, because that's what it is.
They always end up producing the same kind of offspring, just like the Bible says.
Except that the Bible doesn't say that. If it did, it'd be wrong. Because this preacher believes in speciation, where the new strain can no longer interbreed with the other variety to bring forth fertile offspring with them anymore, and would thus no longer be the same kind in the sense that he's talking about. Remember that the Bible says that bats are birds and whales are fish and so are lobsters. So whoever wrote that part of the Bible obviously didn't know what a kind is either, and is not a reliable reference on taxonomy.
The information for the new variety had to be in the gene code already, or it couldn't produce it. No new information is ever added. The gene pool of the new variety is always more limited.
Every sentence this preacher says is another error needing correction. This college textbook on modern genetic analysis says two processes are responsible for genetic variation: recombination and mutation. Mutation is the ultimate source of genetic change. New alleles arise in all organisms, some spontaneously, others as a result of exposure to mutagenic agents in the environment. And these new alleles become the raw material for a second level of variation affected by mutation. So there is new information added, producing new variety in the genome. And the genome of the new variety can be more limited, but it usually isn't. And the funny thing is that this preacher accepts speciation, which is macroevolution by definition, even according to his own sources, though he will never admit that. But he rejects mutation as a source of genetic information, which is a necessary component of microevolution. So he actually accepts macroevolution and rejects micro, but he doesn't realize that because he doesn't know what either one is. It's not just that the preacher doesn't have an accredited degree and obviously never studied any of the things he speaks about so authoritatively. It's worse than that. He apparently doesn't know what any of the words he uses actually mean, according to the scientists who define them. That's why his criticisms don't make sense. He shows no hint that he even knows what he's saying.
Somebody spent years crossbreeding dogs to develop the Chihuahua. All that money to make a dog that's 100% useless. I mean, think about it. How long would the Chihuahuas last in the real world? Turn them all loose into the woods. Watch what happens. They'd run up to the wolf. Yep, 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 yep. Crunch. End of gene code, right?
Notice that this preacher shows how Great Danes and Chihuahuas would immediately become different species as soon as we turn them all loose, if there were no intermediate breeds between them anymore. Thus, the preacher has accidentally proposed a decent thought experiment. What would happen if everyone on Earth knew they were going to die or have to leave the planet tomorrow, so everyone let all their animals loose, and then humanity disappeared, letting our world literally go to the dogs? It is true that many of these hundreds of breeds would go extinct pretty quickly. English bulldogs and a few others would be gone almost immediately. The hundreds of remaining breeds would, I think, consolidate into just a handful based on similar size and capacity. There would be a few that might blend back in with wolves, but not in North America. Most of our wolves went extinct in the 1970s. And then conservationists managed to reinstate wild wolves again. We were very proud about that. But as soon as they were taken off the endangered species list in 2016, I think, our former president ordered that they should all be hunted down and killed by any means possible, no matter how cruel. So American dogs will not blend in with wolves, but you would have some that would fill a similar niche. In the southern areas, we might have packs that would emulate the African painted dogs, which are about the most terrifying high-speed predators I can think of. And we might also have another group of Molossers, being Rottweilers and Mastiffs, that sort of thing, who would feed on our now wild herds of cattle. It's kind of what they were bred for. And once upon a time, they were bullfighters. And this hypothetical scenario would be reminiscent of the Borophagines, like ep7, massive, untamed, and terrifying bone crusher dogs known only from the fossil record. Not as fast, but very powerful, capable of taking down large prey. But it wouldn't just be big dogs. And collies and hounds would band together as the more versatile hunters, becoming maybe the new foxes, since we don't have hardly any more of those anymore either. And then you have even smaller dogs that were initially bred for burrowing. I read that dachshunds were originally bred for hunting badgers in their own dens. If so, then dachshunds and corgis could band together into dorgies, who might then flip the script to become the new badgers in North America. Thus, our hundreds of domestic breeds would, I think, thin out and consolidate into 3 or 4 new varieties that in just a few generations would become distinct species. That would happen in North America because that's how wild dogs have already diversified in South America, Africa, and Asia.
Genetic information is lost, not added when you get a strange variety. Real evolution would need an increase in genetic complexity. We don't ever observe that.
Yes, we do have documented examples of mutations producing new genetic information, but real evolution does not always require an increase in complexity. That's just another straw man misrepresentation. There are also examples of species becoming simpler, more refined. Becoming more efficient can mean reducing complexity.
Now, I grew up in Illinois, corn country. Did you know there are so many kinds of corn up there, they have to number them? You'll be driving down the highway and there's a sign that says BX65. Don't mix it with XL29, something will explode.
Well, you can't mix different kinds of corn because they can only bring forth after their own kind. And the difference between a kind and a species is that while species evolve from other species, a kind is poofed out of nothing by God. And God created lots of different kinds of things, one of them, I guess, being corn in this guy's imagination. So how would farmers have derived different kinds of corn? Did they create them in the lab? Or does the preacher equivocate his use of the word kind?
But folks, you can crossbreed corn from now till the cows come home, and you are always going to get corn. You're never going to get a hamster or a tomato or a whale to grow on your corn stalk. It just ain't going to happen, okay?
Again, this preacher is not describing what evolution is. Instead, he presents a straw man parody to distort evolution into something it isn't, keeping himself and his audience confused. Because if he ever described what evolution really is, how farmers derived corn from a Mexican grass called teosinte by selecting mutations that gave the grass longer seed ears with bigger and better kernels and so on, and that there is only a handful of genes difference between corn and this grass, and that from these mutations, this new information that was not already in the genome, we were able to derive this new species that never existed before, and derive from that all these other cultivars, then the preacher and his audience would both understand evolution. But he doesn't rely on scientific research. Instead, he cites and misinterprets a fable about magic fruit trees and talking animals. Understanding practical realities like how evolution is used in agriculture gets in the way of his favorite folklore. So he substitutes nonsense about plants turning into animals or growing animals on the vine, because the more you understand, the less you believe in the fables he's pushing. And his audience won't and maybe don't even want to understand reality at all.
There's a whole variety of dogs in the world, and they might have had a common ancestor. A dog.
Yes, there are many different species of canid who can no longer interbreed and bring forth after their kind. Dogs, wolves, jackals, even foxes, and a number of fossil forms that the preacher never heard of that also bridge the gap between dogs, bears, and seals. And this link was indicated genetically and was also evidenced with transitional species in the fossil record, with fossil dog bears and bear dogs and even walking seals to close the gap between the earliest proto-bears and sea lions, which are themselves a transitional species towards seals. And all these conoidean carnivorans had a common ancestor, which was, of course, a conoidean carnivoran itself, but it wasn't any of the forms we have alive today.
There's BBC News. It looks like 95% of current dogs came from just 3 original founding females. Hey, they're getting closer. Right here it says, today's dogs come in all shapes and sizes, but scientists believe they evolved from just a handful of wolves tamed by humans living in or near China less than 15,000 years ago. They're getting closer. Man, if they keep studying their Bible, keep studying the science, they're going to be an independent Baptist when they're done. You get done climbing the mountain of truth, that's where you end up, you know. Okay.
Except that this preacher is obviously climbing the wrong mountain. And the reason he doesn't know which mountain is because of which mountain it is. Studying the Bible is not studying the science. Remember that the Bible says that if cattle mate while looking at striped sticks, they'll bear striped calves. So the mere fallible primitive people who wrote the Bible obviously didn't know anything about genetics.
This Irish textbook calls them divergent evolution. Oh, come on, they show 5 dogs around a wolf, and that's not divergent evolution. Don't give it a fancy name. It's still a dog. It's just a variety of dog.
But that is what divergent evolution means. This self-contradicting, scientifically illiterate ignoramus says that he accepts that all dogs came from wolves, but he objects to the fact that there's a term for that, adaptive radiation or divergent evolution. He says giving it a fancy name doesn't change the facts, but he objects to the name because he objects to the facts. He substitutes fantasy stories rather than what evolution really is, trying to convince you that science teaches something it never taught.
This Mexican textbook says, the horse and the zebra had a common ancestor. I agree. It looked like a horse. you know, four-wheel drive, genuine leather upholstery, all the standard horse equipment, okay?
Except that while a horse is a horse, of course, a zebra is not a horse, and neither is a donkey. So their common ancestor wasn't a horse either. Pliohippus looked like a horse, of course, because that's what evolution actually teaches. One species producing two or more descendants like it, but with inherent modification. Not this nonsense of one kind turning into or giving birth to another fundamentally different kind, which evolution doesn't even allow. And this preacher isn't just being ignorant. He's been corrected on this hundreds of times, but he keeps repeating his erroneous assumptions. Years after near constant correction by many knowledgeable people, he still misrepresents what evolution really is to make believe something else instead.
They got little tiny horses today. We had the world's smallest horse come visit our dinosaur adventure land. Talk about useless. I mean, you know, you can't ride it. Well, my granddaughter could, but it won't bark, you know. What do you do with a horse like that?
Another of the principles of common ancestry that they actually do teach, if you're going to take classes on this in college, is that there tends to be more variety within a species than between closely related species.
You know, horses, zebras, and asses can all be crossbred. They have competition in California. Who can get the weirdest animal? They get zorses, zonkies, zeonies, zedonks, zebras, and shebras. Here's a zebra who forgot to put his PJs on. Here's a herd of zebroids running around.
Remember that while different breeds of the same species can produce fertile offspring, members of closely related species in the same genus can usually only produce infertile hybrids, while interbreeding species of different genera, even in the same family, won't produce anything at all. So the preacher's arguments against evolution all align with evolution, what it really is, not what he says it is.
You know, in the last 100 years, the Kentucky Derby's gone from an average winning speed of 127 seconds down to 123 seconds. And even in the old days, they had some pretty low times turned in, okay? Question, how much money would you guess has been spent on selective breeding trying to get the fastest horse for the Kentucky Derby? Millions and millions of dollars. They do the same thing right around here, don't they? Spend lots of money for a Tennessee Walker. What's the most expensive Tennessee walking horse you've ever heard of? $1 million for one horse? $3 million for one horse. That's how much per pound? Man, I was in Italy, we ate horse over there. It's good too. Tastes like chicken, you know. Now, I don't know if they've got to the absolute limit of horse speed or not. I don't know. But I suspect they're getting kind of close, okay? If you really want to win the Kentucky Derby, why don't you breed wings on your horse and fly around the track in 12 seconds?
I've often said that if you want to prove evolution wrong, find whatever creationists say should prove it right. And the specific example that I used was Pegasus, the winged horse, because that violates a few evolutionary laws. I'll put a link below to where I've explained that before. I'm not going to explain it again now, because arguments like breeding a pig that is as big as Texas or breeding a horse to have wings are not even possibly sincere criticisms of evolution. This preacher and believers like him are not arguing in good faith. Instead, his comments are reductio ad absurdum fallacies being used in a celebration of willful ignorance. I will never understand what it's like to be incurious, to not want to know things, especially not in cases like this, where people are actively trying to misunderstand something as badly as they can. Because if they understood it, that would make sense, and they might accept it. And that forbidden knowledge would change their identity and cause them to stop believing in the perverted fables they're still trying so hard to make believe.
The whole point is, sure, you get varieties, but they're limited. There's a bunch of different kinds of cows in the world, and they might have had a common ancestor. A cow.
But how could there be different kinds of cows coming from a common ancestor? A kind means it was specially created by God, and this preacher says that you can't have one kind turning into another kind. But now he says that there's different kinds of cows, and most of them can interbreed to bring forth after their kinds. Of course, the Bible doesn't list the kinds at all, but it does say there's a cattle kind, one kind of cattle. So I guess this preacher is going against his Bible again by suggesting that there are now different kinds. So what is the cattle kind? In modern parlance, the word cattle refers to various domestic breeds that this preacher thinks of as cows, but also things like the yak and the gar and the zebu. That's just in the genus Bos, alongside other bovines like bisons and buffaloes with multiple species in each group. though it is also applicable to every member of the subfamily Bovinae, which includes all those plus things like the four-horned antelope and the African eland. So we already know that the common ancestor of all these things was not a cow, like the preacher said. And plus, the Bible considers sheep and goats to be cattle too. That means that according to the Bible, the cattle kind is not just bovini, not just bovinae, but everything in the taxonomic family Bovidae. That means the addax, the ibex, the wildebeest, bighorn sheep, and even the gazelle are all the same kind, even though none of them can bring forth with the others. They've all changed too much to interbreed productively anymore. And it doesn't stop there, because bovids are all pecorins, meaning even-toed ungulates with ruminant digestion, and pecorins are the subgroup that also have horns. That means deer and antelope and giraffes are all the same kind as sheep and goats and cows. And the fossil record shows primitive transitional forms linking all of these.
This magazine's where you order chickens. All right, boys and girls, should we order, cinnamon queens, red rocks, white rocks, cherry eggers, or brown leghorns? But look what the magazine says. Jungle fowl are the original bird from which all varieties and strains of domesticated chickens are derived. Did you know all the chickens had a common ancestor? Anybody want to guess what it was? Chicken. You got it.
Yet, just as we derived hundreds of breeds of domestic dogs from something that we don't call a dog, we derived many different cultivars of corn from the original corn, which was itself derived from something that was not corn. So we also derived all our breeds of chicken from an original chicken, which was itself derived from an earlier form from among the pheasants, peacocks, and peafowl of the family Phasianidae. So the ancestor of chickens was like a chicken, but was not a chicken.
There are 8 kinds of bears in the world, and they might have had a common ancestor. A bear.
I have to explain that in modern taxonomy, there is a concept called a clade, a category that includes all the descendants of a common ancestor. So bears would be a clade, where every extant or extinct species of bear that ever lived were all derived from one original bear, which is the crown or beginning of that clade. And the only difference between a clade and a creationist attempt to redefine kinds is that the clade of bears and clade of dogs both descend from a common ancestor within the larger enveloping clade of Canoidea, whereas a kind is exactly the same thing, but each one begins with a special creation, so they're not related. Every kind would have begun in the creation week, and every kind of animal that still exists today would have a clade whose common ancestor or crown would have been a passenger on Noah's mythic ark. Now, we know there was no global flood of Noah's Ark, but we use that to try to reason with believers to get them to understand how their notion of kinds is inconsistent and doesn't work. If there were 8 different kinds of bears, then Noah had 8 different pairs of bears on his ark. That's 16 bears in all, unless we also include the several different species of bears that are known from the fossil record. Are they the same kind, or are they different kinds, and how can we tell? Even if the preacher corrects himself to say that there was only 1 pair of bears and 1 pair of dogs on Noah's Ark from which all other bears and dogs are derived, then why are there both genetic links and fossil transitions between the two, as well as other links between undifferentiated dog bears and mustelids, the weasel family, and procyonids, with all these groups descending from a fossil form known from the Miacids? So the common ancestor between bears, dogs, and weasels wasn't a bear or a dog or a weasel, but an ancient animal that bore a genetic signature and a family resemblance to all its descendants.
Broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, and Brussels sprouts all have a common ancestor called a plant.
Once again, the common ancestor of broccoli and cabbage was neither broccoli nor cabbage. We have multiple lines of archaeological and genetic evidence indicating that it was the wild mustard plant. And while each of these is considered a cultivar of the same species, they were each derived by unique mutations, new genetic information that was not shared with the other strains and is not found in the ancestral genome either.
In California, they got huge fields where they graft English walnut trees onto black walnut stumps. They do it because the black walnut stump, the root system is tough and can handle the weather over there. But the black walnut doesn't taste as good, it doesn't sell for as much money, and it's tougher to crack. English walnuts taste better, they sell for more money, and they're easier to crack, but the root system rots. So they cut them off and stick them together. They do it all over there. Well, they can do it because they're both a walnut. See, you could never graft an English walnut tree onto the back of a turtle. That won't work, see?
Every erroneous criticism this preacher ignorantly makes against evolution is an argument for evolution, but he doesn't seem to know that because he's determined to push this nonsense straw man of one kind of thing changing into another fundamentally different kind of thing. I call him ignorant because I think that's the most polite way to describe someone who has been corrected on this hundreds of times by experts in the field, but keeps repeating what he should know by now was always wrong.
The sugar beets were used for years. When sugar got expensive, they wanted to get sugar out of beets. So they tried to do selective breeding to increase the sugar content in sugar beets. They raised it from 6% to 17%, but could not. They ran into a brick wall. Hey, can't go past 17. And the further they got away from the normal wild sugar beet, the more problems they started having. Now you got to babysit the field and spray pesticides and bugicides and everything else on it, okay? Because its disease resistance goes down.
Two more important lessons on how evolution works. Natural selection works for the benefit of the organism to make it better able to survive and thrive, but artificial selection models organisms for our benefit instead, making things that are dependent on the very overlords that are just going to eat it. Another problem is that natural selection works very slowly and has plenty of time to work out all the kinks in the new mods, but artificial selection is rushed, trying to market as soon as it can be, without all the research and development that natural selection would have effectively done through generations of testing with minor tweaks constantly applied here and there.
People say, don't bacteria become resistant to drugs? Well, that's because they lose information, not gain it. I'll show you. Dr. Spettner points out, this is based on a misunderstanding, for the mutations that cause antibiotic resistance still involve information loss. For example, to destroy a bacterium, the antibiotic streptomycin attaches to part of a bacterial cell called ribosomes. Mutations sometimes cause a structural deformity in ribosomes. Since the antibiotic cannot connect with the misshapen ribosome, the bacterium is resistant. Even though this mutation turns out to be beneficial for the moment, it still constitutes a loss of information, not a gain. No evolution has taken place. The bacteria are not stronger. In fact, under normal conditions with no antibiotic present, they are weaker than their non-mutated cousins. I'll give you an example. Suppose somebody's coming through town and they're handcuffing everybody, taking them off to jail, and then they're going to kill them. But you don't have any arms, so they can't handcuff you. Ha. Is that a beneficial mutation to not have arms? Well, yeah, for the moment, okay. But in long term, it's not beneficial, okay? And so all the examples they ever point to are bacteria becoming resistant to drugs. That's a loss of information, not a gain.
Beta-lactam's antibiotics seize and disable penicillin-binding proteins, leaving them unable to maintain the bacterial cell wall and consequently lead to the death of the cell. However, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus acquired a genetic resistance to beta-lactam's antibiotics by adding a block to the shape of their transpeptidase, enabling those proteins to continue building cell walls unrestrained. This would arguably be a gain in genetic information, but creationists will not offer any metric to determine whether information is lost that does not also show instances where it is gained. For example, some mutations are deletions or they disable genes, but there are others that are duplications or additions of whole new genes, and several examples of novel genes. Additional information have been documented by geneticists. There are other, even better examples than bacterial resistance, which we'll get into in the next episode. But technically, any change in information is new information by definition.
The Bible is correct. They bring forth after their kind.
We've already shown how the preacher is misreading the Bible here. This pseudoscience apologist is unwittingly arguing for the evolutionary concept of cladistics, and he is arguing against his own straw man fallacy of one kind turning into a fundamentally different kind of thing. But that is actually what creationism argues, like when a rib is turned into a fully formed adult woman. Is that transfiguration, transubstantiation, train subway station? Anyway, the preacher doesn't understand all the mechanisms involved, but he is still endorsing what evolution really is while trying to tell you that it's not that, because he wants you to believe that it's something else.